Welcome everybody to today's session on Turn on Federalism. Welcome to the session on federalism and conflict resolution. My name is Soren Kyle. I work as an academic at Canterbury Christ Church University in the UK, and I am one of the co-directors of the website 50shadesofFederalism.com, where the initial papers for our speaker series have been published. I'm very glad to welcome you all. Please allow me to start with some opening comments for today's session. Today's session is organized by the Hans Seidel Foundation and 50 Shades of Federalism in partnership. The Hans Seidel Foundation is a German political foundation entrusted with a mandate from the German Federal Parliament, and its core tasks include the promotion of democracy and the rule of law within Germany, especially through political education in Bavaria, but also in worldwide projects with over 100 projects in more than 60 countries. 50 Shades of Federalism is a project established in 2017 at Canterbury Christ Church University, and the idea behind it is to promote discussion on the topic of federalism. We publish short research articles on many different topics of federalism. They are usually around 6 to 8 pages long. They are completely free to download, to read, and to use from our website. The new speaker series, Turn on Federalism, is a collaboration between the two organizers, and the aim is to engage the experts, politicians, and civil society activists that have written for 50 Shades of Federalism in discussion with other interested actors on issues related to federalism, to decentralization, to democracy, and to the promotion of peace. We aim to further the debate on these topics, as well as to create new networks and to create new exchanges between countries, between scholars, and between activists. Our topic today is federalism and conflict resolution. This is a very big topic, one that has been at the center of both academic research and practical considerations in many countries around the world. There literally is no conflict on earth right now in which federalism or decentralization is not at least in a small part being discussed as part of the solution to the conflict. From Syria to Libya, from Ukraine to Moldova, from Ethiopia to Myanmar, we are seeing debates about federalism and decentralization all across the globe. So the questions of when federalism can contribute to peace and when is it likely to succeed are very, very important. But our session today will not only focus on when federalism can succeed, but also focus on some of the challenges. We need to remember that 50% of conflicts that sign a peace agreement return to violence within 5 years. So how can we build more inclusive peace? And what role can federalism play will be at the heart of today's discussion. If you have any questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A box on your Zoom window. We will pass all the questions on to Professor Walsh and make sure that the questions will be answered. Please also feel free to join us in our Spanish, French, or Myanmar language translation. Please go on the translation button in your Zoom panel and choose the correct language. Finally, please allow me to introduce today's speaker. Professor Don Walsh is an assistant professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University College Dublin in Ireland. She is also the director of the Institute of British-Irish Studies at the same institution. She is an expert on territorial solutions to violent conflict. She has also published widely on different case studies, including Bosnia, Iraq, and Moldova, and has researched what institutions might contribute to keeping peace in post-conflict society. More recently, also in her role as the director of the Institute of British and Irish Studies, she has also looked at what role federalism might play in the future of Northern Ireland after Brexit. Today's event will be moderated by Anja Richter, who is the resident representative of the Untitled Foundation in London in the United Kingdom. Without further ado, please allow me to hand over to Professor Walsh for today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soren. Just one moment now. We'll share my presentation. Sorry, does not seem to be working. Okay, well, we'll just persevere with it like this. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk to you a little bit about some research that I carried out a couple of years ago now, which looked at the role of federalism and of what I call territorial self-government more broadly as a conflict management or conflict resolution mechanism. And the reason that I'm interested in federalism and in territorial self-government is, as Soren pointed out, these concepts are at the heart of many current and proposed peace agreements. However, despite the fact that they are central to many proposed or signed peace accords, there are some serious concerns around the adoption of federalism or territorial self-governance mechanisms in these contexts. So for conflict parties to sign a peace agreement and to lay down their arms, they need to be confident that the other side will also lay down their arms and implement the peace agreement. However, where federalism or territorial self-government is part of a conflict management strategy, this can be problematic. Sorry, I'm not sure. Oh. And when I talk about territorial self-government, I'm including federalism, but I'm also including other institutional mechanisms that involve the delegation of a public policy role, an independent public policy role to a sub-state territorial unit. So this also includes things like devolution, autonomy, decentralization, or enhanced local government. And why these arrangements can be particularly problematic in a post-conflict context is that there can be fears on both sides. So for the groups who are receiving enhanced territorial self-government and from the central government, that these arrangements will not be stable. And there can be fears that one side or the other will try to unilaterally change them. And this is particularly problematic where you're implementing federalism or enhanced territorial self-government, because the very institutions that have been established can be used to advocate for further autonomy or even secession. However, on the other side, minorities often who have been granted territorial self-government or a federal unit as part of a peace agreement are equally often concerned that central government will in future re-centralize these powers, undermining the autonomy that they have achieved. So this unhappy compromise or tension brought me through my research to the idea of guarantee mechanisms. So I look at guarantee mechanisms both at the domestic and the international level, And guarantee mechanisms are ways of motivating or ensuring that the federalism as agreed in the peace accord or the other form of territorial self-government is respected by the different conflict parties, and if it is changed, that is not unilaterally, but rather by further negotiation. At a domestic level, guarantee mechanisms can be either written into the Constitution, and they can also be written through special laws. So, for example, laws that require a supermajority to be changed, or they can simply be ordinary legislation, though this is the weakest domestic guarantee we would expect. At an international level, I've divided the guarantees into two different categories. So the first are hard guarantees. So here we have, for example, military guarantees, so peacekeepers on the ground in conflict regions to ensure the territorial arrangements are respected. But also we can have soft guarantees, and this is usually in the form of policy conditionality. So what I'd like to do today is I looked in my research at 5 different cases. So I looked at Northern Ireland in the UK, I looked at Bosnia, I looked at Iraqi Kurdistan, I looked at North Macedonia, and I looked at the Gagoons conflict in Moldova. And what I'd like to do is just give you an example from some of these cases as to how these guarantees have been adopted and implemented, and to talk a little bit about where there may have been weaknesses or successes in them, in ensuring that the federal or the territorial arrangements were respected after the adoption of a peace agreement. So the first thing we'll do is we'll look at the domestic guarantees, and we'll start with ordinary domestic legislation. So in the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland, as part of their peace agreement, it was agreed that there would be institutional cooperation between the new assembly at Belfast in Northern Ireland and the Irish government in Dublin. However, this cross-border cooperation in an institutional format, not everybody supported this. So particularly unionists in Northern Ireland were quite wary that this territorial arrangement would be expanded without their consent until it became an effective all-Ireland government, therefore deviating from the agreed autonomy that Northern Ireland would enjoy under the 1998 peace agreement. So when there were negotiations in 2006 to update this peace agreement, the unionists demanded that a provision be included in this new agreement, which specified that any development of this north-south cooperation between Belfast and Dublin could only be done so with the approval of the Assembly at Stormont and Belfast. And this effectively gave the Unionists a veto over any development of north-south cooperation. And you can see here is a quote from the major unionist political parties' manifesto in the election in the following year. So they really felt that this ordinary guarantee provided by the British government, so the Northern Ireland St Andrews Agreement Act was an ordinary piece of legislation through Westminster, but they really felt that this gave them confidence that the territorial arrangements would not be deviated from without their consent. Then if we turn to the issue of a special piece of domestic legislation, we can look at the case of the Gagoons in Moldova. So as part of a conflict resolution process, the Gagoons were granted a special status and have an autonomy. And their autonomy is protected by a special law within Moldova that requires 3/5 of the members of parliament to approve any change. So this supermajority may seem to be quite a strong protection when we look at it first. However, what you need to do is you need to look at the particular demographics and political system in which a guarantee is operating. And so the Gagoos people are a very small group within Moldova, and the electoral system used within Moldova means that they send very few MPs to the National Assembly. So this means that in fact, it is quite easy for the central government to get a 3/5 majority to change the Gagoons' special status as an autonomy without the consent of the Gagoons themselves. And this has been a source of worry and anxiety for Gagoons leaders over the years. And you have seen public debate that suggests that in fact, it would be better to change this so that rather than looking for a 3/5 majority in the central parliament, that instead you looked for concurrent majorities. So to change this law would require not only a majority at the national parliament level, but also a majority within the local assembly in the Gagoons autonomy. So this shows us that we really need to be careful when designing guarantee mechanisms to ensure that they respect the particular arrangements in demographics and political institutions within a state. Then if we look at the strongest domestic guarantee, again, we can see this in Northern Ireland, where there is a constitutional guarantee that the territorial arrangements provided for in the 1998 peace agreement will not be changed without agreement. So the Irish Constitution, adopted in the 1930s, actually has Articles 2 and 3, which claimed sovereignty over the entire island of Ireland, apologies. And obviously this irredentist claim was a source of a lot of fear and suspicion from the unionist community within Northern Ireland. But as part of the 1998 peace agreement, a referendum was held in Ireland and these articles were changed. And now these articles state that while the Irish government would like to see the unification of the island of Ireland in one state, that this will only ever happen with the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. What I think is particularly interesting, though, about this constitutional guarantee is it was provided to the unionist community in 1998 as part of that original Good Friday Agreement or Belfast Agreement. However, if you remember what I spoke about a moment ago, in 2006, the unionist community were still wary about being brought into a united Ireland against their will and required an ordinary level domestic guarantee from the British government. And this underlines the importance of the trust relationship between the person providing or the government providing the guarantee and the party seeking the guarantee. So the unionist community in Northern Ireland trusted an ordinary guarantee from the British government more than they did a constitutional guarantee from the Irish government. So then if we look very briefly at examples of international guarantees, if we look firstly at a military guarantee provided where you had federal arrangements adopted as part of a peace agreement, we can look to Bosnia. So obviously Dayton provided for a federal Bosnia with two main entities. And the peacekeepers who were present in Bosnia after the conflict, of course, provided for general security that had been absent during the conflict, but they also had a mandate to ensure that the Dayton Agreement was upheld, including the territorial arrangements. And when the leadership of this force transferred to the EU, you will see the High Representative mentioning that this force is an important deterrent to anti-Dayton activities. However, in 2007, the force was drawn down and is now very small and mainly Sarajevo based, and it no longer represents a significant military deterrent to those who might seek to act against the territorial and the federal arrangements in that Dayton Peace Agreement, which is very worrying, particularly in light of a lot of the secessionist rhetoric that we see out of some of the leadership in the Republic of Srpska. So this shows that an international military guarantee is not going to be kept on in perpetuity, even where there's been widespread violence. So if there continues to be instability, a military guarantee may not act against that. And then if we look to trade, you can actually have a soft international guarantee through trade or aid policy conditionality. And we see this in Iraqi Kurdistan in a very interesting way. So the Iraqi Kurds had been forsaken by the American government and Western allies on a number of occasions when geopolitical priorities shifted. So in the aftermath of the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein's regime, they were not confident that the American government or the Western allies would protect the federal status of the Kurdish unit within Iraq. And therefore they looked at developing other international relationships which they felt would be a guarantee of the federal status of Iraqi Kurdistan. And one of the main ways which they did this is the Kurdish regional government pursued international oil contracts with international companies without the involvement of the federal government in Baghdad. Now, interestingly, this dramatically increased tensions between the Kurdish regional government and the government in Baghdad, who felt that the Kurdish regional government were acting outside of its authority. However, we can see in this quote that I show here from the president of the Kurdish regional government that they feel that this is a very successful strategy and that international companies will act as a strong guarantee of the federal status of Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, obviously, developments around ISIS and around the unilateral referendum that the Kurdish regional government then held in terms of independence have dramatically changed the reality on the ground and have undermined in many ways the federal status of Iraqi Kurdistan. But at the time, this pursuit of international trade links as a guarantee to their federal status was a really key policy that the Kurdish regional government was pursuing. So then, if I just conclude, I've only had a chance, of course, to take you through a few examples in the different countries that I've studied. And in most of these countries, you will see both domestic and international and different types of domestic and international guarantees in operation together. And they can be effective, but there's a couple of caveats. So the first one is that domestic guarantees only work where you have a strong rule of law and also where the different parties have equal access to a neutral arbiter, be that the courts or a separate body set up to investigate any deviations from domestic law in terms of the federal or territorial arrangements. In terms of international guarantees, these can be very effective, but international guarantees nearly exclusively focus on preventing secession rather than preventing re-centralization of powers. And also whether international guarantees are provided to a particular country is dependent on a number of factors, including the level of conflict in that country and the geopolitical priorities of powers such as the US, Russia. And this can mean that even in some cases where international guarantees would be very useful, the international community is not willing to step forward and provide them. So if you're interested in a further kind of looking into how these guarantees operate, a couple of years ago, I published a book that looks in depth at each of these 5 case studies. So feel free to check it out. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dawn. And to our global audience, I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of the Hans Seidel Foundation, of course. I now have the pleasure to moderate this part of today's event, where we're able to discuss some of the issues Dawn has mentioned in more detail, but also widen the debate and address questions most relevant to your respective countries. I'll take the liberty and start with a few questions to get us going, but of course this is the chance for you guys out there watching and participating in this event to ask your questions. And as Sören has explained previously, please use the Q&A box to pose any questions you have for Dawn, and I will try and get through as many as I can. So just to start us off, Dawn, in your paper, you speak about unhappy compromises and that often federalist structures are just inherently unstable. Is the creation of federalist or decentralized, devolved structures, whatever you call them, still a useful conflict resolution and conflict management mechanism?
Yeah, no, I would definitely say it is. And there's 2 reasons I would say that. I would say, firstly, the post-conflict states in general tend to be unstable. So I don't think that it's uniquely the adoption of federalism or territorial self-government that is feeding that dynamic. But I would also say that these arrangements, while unhappy compromises, are very often the only acceptable compromise to the conflict parties. And that is why I started to study ways in which they could be stabilized rather than looking for an alternative. And in the book, I take you kind of through each of the cases, using John Burton's human needs theory, kind of understanding of conflict as driven by a need for groups to be recognized and to have a sense of security, and how territorial self-government can provide both that sense of security and that sense of group recognition, and why therefore it's a useful tool in trying to manage or resolve conflicts.
And you have spoken about the importance of trust, that federalism needs guaranteed mechanisms, but also requires trust between the conflict parties to adhere to the rules. How do you turn people into true federalists, trusting each other?
Yeah, so in post-conflict contexts, mistrust rather than trust tends to be the default emotion that conflict parties feel towards each other. And there are a number of ways that this can be addressed. And the first thing that I would say is that time helps. The political institutions embed over time, and that political interactions are a game of a number of rounds. So if you see the other side implementing and abiding by the rules, then every time an interaction follows these rules, you have greater confidence that the next time you come up against a situation that the rules will be followed. And the other thing I would say is, if the rules are working for people, if they are meeting their need for group recognition and meeting their need for security, then people will see the value in those institutions and see that particularly groups looking for secession tends not to be supported by the international community. It's a very difficult path for a minority group to go down. And if you can see that the needs can as easily be met, and most of the needs can be met within a federal structure, I think that makes that very attractive to people.
Going back to some of your examples, and taking the example of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's been exactly 25 years, this or last week I think, since the agreement that ended the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was signed at an American airbase in Dayton, Ohio. Since then, has there been a shift from more short-term, somewhat external imposition of federalist structures as part of a peace agreement, like the Dayton example, to a more long-term focus on capacity building, training, or supporting the conflict parties to establish trust between each other and enhance the credibility of those new federalist structures?
So I do think there's definitely been what we call a local turn in peace building over the last 25 years. So the almost completely externally negotiated nature of Dayton, I don't think would be acceptable in 2020. And I think that's for very good reason, that if you want people to operate institutions, they need to feel that they have had some part in designing them and in the negotiations so that those institutions meet their needs. Whereas I think it's arguable that Dayton didn't necessarily meet the needs of Bosnian citizens and was really about more regional players in that area, and that has led to many of the problems in the agreement. It's quite dysfunctional, and not just because of the federation, but also because of the way power sharing has been set up in that case.
You describe the international community as the ultimate guarantor of the Dayton Peace Agreement, ensuring that mechanisms would be respected. Does the international community and international actors such as the US or the EU still have that credibility today?
Bluntly, no. So I mean, there's still a high representative presence in Bosnia. There's still a small ability for them to kind of disincentivize anti-Dayton activity. But there are problems that we've seen, particularly over the last 4 to 10 years, a kind of weakening of multilateralism within the international community. So many of the resolutions that were passed around Dayton through the Security Council at the time, I don't feel would be passed today because of maybe vetoes from Russia or from China. So I don't think, while it's always problematic to talk about an international community, there was some consensus at the time of Dayton, and that consensus really has dissipated. And looking even at other conflicts, places like Syria, like Ethiopia, you don't have any kind of consensus approach by the international community now that can be used to try and support the local actors to reaching an agreement, which is really problematic.
We've got a question from the audience, which is, can you explain more on non-territory federalism? Would it be helpful for a diverse society such as Myanmar? Of course, most of our audience is based there, so we'll be particularly interested in your answer.
Yes, so firstly, I'm not an expert on Myanmar, so we will put that out there as a caveat to my answer. But there is actually quite a lot of research on what, not necessarily what we would call non-territorial federalism, but non-territorial autonomy that has been used for divided societies as a conflict resolution mechanism, where particular, for example, types of public policy are organized by identity groups. And this is often public policy that's around culture, or things like education, that you would run separate concurrent education systems that respect the different cultures of different groups. This can be done, there are some kind of warnings. It's not always effective. It can be quite expensive because you're running parallel institutions, so that can be quite difficult. And there's also questions of like how large a particular group needs to be in a particular region for there to be a school or a hospital or a government office that caters to their specific group. So non-territorial types of autonomy are possible, but they can be tricky to put in place and costly.
You've already mentioned some sort of public policy issues that are quite common to be devolved or decentralized in many federalist structures. And many federalizing countries, but also older federalist countries, grapple with the question of what powers and competences should or can be decentralized. Health and education, of course, but even different election rules, like we've seen in the US recently, that led to certain chaos. Are there any competences or powers that should never be centralized?
Okay, so never is a very strong word, and I'm an academic, so I'm always a little bit reluctant to say that. So you really do need to be context specific when designing institutions. But in terms of areas that it's kind of more problematic to decentralize is, for example, so military decentralization. The military is a very expensive part of a lot of countries' public spending. So you are really making an additional cost on the public or on the taxpayer there. And obviously a lot of post-conflict countries have already a lot of questions around state capacity and have other more important kind of humanitarian needs that perhaps they should be using their funding to address. But also where you decentralize the military, you do provide then, if there are pushes for further autonomy, you essentially provide a force that can go and can make that a violent struggle or an armed struggle more easily. So the military is one to be I'd be very reluctant to decentralize. There is also a wider kind of rethinking of federalism in light of the idea of the universal nature of human rights. And so there's also ideas that rights for example, people from LGBTI communities, and that these shouldn't be devolved, and that all citizens in a state should enjoy federal protection in terms of their basic human rights. And that is quite a move from traditional federalism, where oftentimes cultural deviations were expected. And there really is a pushback against this in terms of the universality of human rights.
We have another Myanmar specific question from our audience. I'll just read it out to you. It's very useful information to learn from Ireland and Bosnia. The question is a country like Myanmar that is quite complex and where the government does not want the international community to get involved, and with no obvious guarantees in the constitution, and people not being very informed about federalism yet, maybe. I think our colleagues from the foundation are working on that. And it's also open for interpretation, so everyone understands something different under federalism. Do you think it would take longer to transform a country like Myanmar to become a federalized country given those circumstances?
So I think the sheer size of countries and the sheer number of people that you're talking about in terms of changing the provision of services and at what level decisions are being made at, there's always going to be, and I think there should be quite a gradual transition process. I don't think shocks to political systems are necessarily ever a good thing. What I would say in terms of people understanding different things by federalism, that tends to be actually a situation found everywhere. So what you need to do if you're going to talk about adopting federalism is to be very specific about what you mean by federalism. So what public policies do you think for your country should be devolved? Are you going to use defined lists where you say these are the list of competencies for the central state, these are the list of competencies for the federal units, and are they going to be symmetrical? So will all federal units enjoy the same competencies? That's not a requirement. So devolution in the UK is asymmetric. And I also think you need to then have a conversation with ordinary citizens. And this is something that's starting in Ireland, because there is discussions that in light of Brexit, we may be facing a referendum on a united Ireland. And if it were to be a federal Ireland, to recognise the unique nature of Northern Ireland, what would that look like? And in Ireland, the ordinary citizens are also not very familiar with federalism. So there is a public information campaign that has to be part of this.
Speaking of referenda, although being based in the UK, that's a very toxic issue. But generally, do you think a referendum and getting the people's consent is a necessary requirement? Or can it also be unhelpful because of a lack of information or a lack of understanding? So you're asking people who don't know what federalism means to decide about it. Again, going back to Brexit.
Yes, and I think that one of the things, so I think that referendums can be helpful in some contexts, because then if there are parties, for example, who try to deviate from the arrangements, it's very easy to call them out as illegitimate, because this is an arrangement that has been approved by the people. It's not simply an elite level bargain. However, and I think the Brexit referendum really undermines the necessity of not simply voting on an upper level principle with no detail and telling people that you will decide on the detail later, that the devil is actually in the detail. So that if you were to have a referendum, you need to be very clear about people in terms of like, what are those lists of competencies? What are the federal units? How will any future changes be made? And people need to see the package that they're voting on. But oftentimes these referendums are also taking place and taking into consider the wider peace agreement. And that can be very difficult, because peace agreements always involve compromise. And it can be very easy for extremists on both sides to use referendums to destabilize peace accords.
And we've got another question on this sort of public discussion, public information, deliberations. Should the process of discussion and deliberation be open-ended all the time in order to provide better federalism? And what could be the side effects of such an open-ended process?
Yeah, so that's a brilliant question, because there are obviously pros and cons on both sides. So peace agreements need to be stable enough to give them a chance for new political institutions and norms to become embedded in a political culture, and for people to develop this trust in each other and in the institutions. However, inflexible arrangements are super problematic. And you mentioned the voting in the US, and one of the problems there is, you know, we don't see certain crises coming. So nobody saw the COVID pandemic coming. And if you have federal arrangements that are not flexible, and then you have, for example, a particular crisis that emerges, you need arrangements that are flexible enough to respond and to develop in real time to say, well, so who is dealing with this in terms of the health provisions? Who's dealing with this in terms of the economic provisions? Do we change our fiscal federalism in order to ensure that maybe more socioeconomically challenged areas of a country, or areas of a country that are worst hit by the pandemic, get more federal support. So you really need to be flexible to be able to respond to crises that we don't see coming. So there needs to be some mechanisms built into arrangements for revision, but for revision by agreement, not by the decision of one party.
We've got a question, although I'm not quite clear as it's not specific, but while we were talking about local government and federal level, I want to know more about local government and federalism state. So maybe you could expand a bit on what ideally, or from your studies and experiences, a good model for local government in a federalized country could look like.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is the more layers of government you add, the more complicated things get. And so you need to be careful that you're not creating levels of government just for the sake of it. So the country in which I studied decentralization or enhanced local government was North Macedonia, which is a very small country. And so they had, central state, and then they had enhanced local government, and they didn't really have a level in between. But if you're a very big country, so you're the US or you're India, it makes sense in order to bring social services and to bring decisions about social services close to the people. So this kind of EU principle of subsidiarity, it does make sense to couple federalism with local government. But then when you're drawing up which level of government enjoys which competency, you're now working with 3 rather than 2 levels. And at that stage as well, I suggest that you may want to have particular mechanisms that allow for cooperation between these levels and communication to ensure that policies aren't counterproductive or cancelling each other out, or that you also don't have replication of services, which is obviously very inefficient.
Yeah, we're getting some serious questions on that now, which is money. Some federal countries use the equalization revenue sharing among the federal and the constituent units. In your study, is there any country that uses that revenue sharing system? And if not, what types do they use in sharing revenues?
So in the countries
also brings the question of tax.
So in the countries I studied, there were very different approaches to fiscal federalism or fiscal decentralization. So you have a number of options there. So you have this idea of revenue sharing. So when central government shares national revenue between the different units, and ways in which you may want to do that. And that can be based on the population of different units, but also it can be based on the current economic and social position of units. So you may have a unit that maybe isn't quite as large, but is suffering from more disadvantage than other parts of the country. So you may want to see a larger federal transfer to that unit. But you can also have a situation where federal units or even local government has the power to raise its own revenue. So you see them raising new taxes, or in the case of Moldova, bringing in new licenses, for example, that entrepreneurs or certain businesses have to pay to local government. And these are forms of raising revenue. But I think what has to be of central consideration when you're talking about fiscal federalism is to ensure that firstly, you don't have an unfunded mandate, so that whatever level of government is charged with providing a service, that they are given enough revenue to provide that service, but also that you don't encourage economic disparities across different units. So one of the key drivers, if you look at research of conflict within federations, is economic disparity between the different units. So that may often require certain federal units to be kind of de facto contributors to the federal budget, while others to be de facto takers from the federal budget. And this can be something that is a source of tension between the wealthier units who maybe do not want to have transfers to another federal unit, but it's important to try and level the socioeconomic playing field across the federation.
Does that also apply to your case study of Iraq? We were just speaking about revenues and taxes and licenses, and obviously in Iraq it was oil. What lessons can be learned from Kurdistan?
Okay, so one of the main lessons that can be learned from Kurdistan is you need to have clarity. So the agreements in terms of whether it was a federal unit or the central government who enjoyed oil revenue and who had the autonomy to make oil deals and for what periods of time, was all very unclear. So after the Iraqi invasion was there to topple Saddam Hussein, and the creation of a new Iraqi state was really an afterthought by the invading forces. And there was attempts to try and come up with language that both the central government in Baghdad and the Iraqi Kurdish regional government would agree to. And while the language was agreed to, the language was only agreed to because they had distinctly different interpretations of what that would mean going forward. So you can only maintain ambiguity for so long. So once people actually start to implement a law, they see that they have very divergent interpretations of it. That's a really dangerous situation in a complex situation. So you really need to have clarity about who's getting what revenue, who's raising what revenue, and if you have transition periods in terms of time, what those transition periods are.
Speaking about clarity, we have a question on what kind of constitutional guarantees you should have between ensuring that mechanism between the central government and the constituent units or federalized units. Can you give any advice? We have someone who says Myanmar was once called the Eastern Ireland because of the struggle for independence. So any thoughts on a constitutional guarantee for Myanmar?
Yeah, so if we look at Moldova, this is a really good case of what not to do in terms of a constitutional guarantee. So they have an article in the Moldovan constitution about the Gagoons autonomy, but it doesn't specify what are the competencies of the Gagoons authority. It's completely lacking in detail. So Gagoons leaders look at this and say, this does not provide us any protection. If the government wants to start legislating in areas of our competency, we cannot point to the constitution because it does not say that that is our specific autonomy competency. So I think that it depends on what is the source of the mistrust between the two parties. So in the Gagoons, in the Moldovan case, the source is that the Gagoons are a very small minority and they're not very well resourced. So they are very afraid of the centralizing nature of the Moldovan central government. So it would have been very beneficial in that case to more clearly set out what powers are protected for them. Whereas in the Irish case, it was simply that the unionist community in Northern Ireland were afraid that the Irish government had irredentist claims, and it had in a symbolic way in the constitution, even though they were never acted upon. So simply the removal of those really set aside a lot of those fears. So you need to get to what is the source of the mistrust and then use the constitutional guarantee to directly address that.
We've got a few questions on democracy and federalism, which was the main topic of our last seminar, of course. And you have mentioned the necessity for a strong rule of law to ensure those mechanisms. But what about democracy and federalism? What, for example, in the case of Myanmar, needs to be done to successfully transform to become democratic federalism? And the contentious question, do you need to be a democracy to be a fully functioning federalist state?
Okay, so that's a very sensitive one, and I think that the experts will differ on this. So some experts of federalism will look at countries that are clearly not democratic and treat them as federations in the same way as they treat countries that are democratic as federations. So I think that federalism is about a division of powers between central government and geographic sub-state units. So I would say that you can be federal without being democratic. Would I prioritize federalization ahead of democratization? No. From a normative point of view, I think that it's extremely important, obviously, that democracy and that the different elements of democracy, so not just procedural elections, but freedom of speech, freedom of association, basic human rights, that those are key pillars that improve the lives of citizens. So from a normative point of view, I would prioritize democratization over federalism. But I do think you can be a federation without being a democracy. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I mean, I can follow up with an even more contentious issue. Looking at the biggest or probably most known federalist state in the world, the United States, of course, which currently seems a bit, struggling to balance democracy and federalism. And often people say, well, in democratic countries, it's messier. So would you assume that, and you just said you should prioritize democracy over federalism, would you therefore not recommend to democratize and federalize at the same time? So the question is, would there be more conflicts if Myanmar becomes a federal democratic country, so doing both at the same time?
Not necessarily, because there are elements of federalization and democratization that go hand in hand, that are complementary. So the idea of, providing services to people at a more local level that meets their needs and are responsive to their needs. So that is both a principle within democracy and a principle within federalism. And similarly, the idea of providing minority groups with security and recognition, which is, for me, at the heart of federalism, is also fully compatible with democracy, as long as you don't allow cultural deviations or group-based deviations that deny people their basic human rights. So I don't think they have to be in conflict. I mean, if you're talking about a very large and complicated country like Myanmar, and you're talking about radical changes to political institutions to put in place both federalism and democracy, that's not going to happen overnight. There's going to be a transition period, but I don't think that you need to put, for example, federalism on hold until you achieve some desired level of democracy, however you choose to measure that. I think that they can be a kind of concurrent process that can be quite complementary.
So in your experience, speaking a bit more generally, in addition to the guarantees you've talked about, what makes federalism work? So, lessons many countries, apart from Myanmar, can take on board.
Okay, so what I would say is key is to have a clear delineation of competencies. So however you choose to do that will depend on your particular context. So whether you want to have two clear lists that say what powers lay with the federal government and what powers lie with the sub-state units, or what is often done is that you will say X number of powers lie with one level of government, and then all of the other things that are not mentioned lie with the other level of government. And that can be helpful because, like around coronavirus or emerging technologies, if you make lists, you're not going to have thought of everything. So then you can have a question when something emerges as to where that competency lies. So I think that it's very important to have clear competencies for different levels. And then I also communication and cooperation between the different parts of a federation, if the different levels of government in a federation are key. And there are different ways you can do this. So for example, if you have a federal state and you have governors of each federal unit, do they have the possibility to meet with the central government at specific intervals to discuss the needs of their region, to discuss maybe any national policies that they're not very happy with? So this kind of communication, and this has been kind of a problem, not in federation, but in devolution. In the United Kingdom, there has not really been an ability for the devolved administrations to feed into Westminster in a meaningful way. So it's really important to have that kind of cooperation between the different levels of government. So they're kind of two key elements, which I would say are lessons that could be applied really anywhere.
And in this context, the question, how important is it to ensure a balanced or equivalent powers between the federal level and the constituent units?
I would say not necessarily important. That how you decide to divide those powers is really context specific. and isn't going to be the same in different cases. So the aim, I wouldn't say for me, the aim isn't necessarily to have an equally powerful federal government and state or sub-state federal unit government, that's not necessarily always ideal, and that you may actually want to have a stronger federal government for particular reasons. So in order to ensure, say, if you have a regional security threat, a strong federal government that can provide a military that protects you from that might be desirable. And you might also have sub-state units that don't have the capacity to take on large amounts of competencies, particularly if you're designing your sub-state units based on different identity groups. Just because a group of people identify as, with a shared language or shared ethnicity, they might be quite small in population number and in resources. So simply transferring a massive amount of competencies to them is not ideal. So you really need to look and see what your specific circumstances are. So it doesn't always have to be balanced.
And there's a second part of the question, which is the role of the independent judiciary. Where does that come in?
Yeah, so this is key. And if you don't have an independent judiciary, then your domestic guarantees that I talked about are simply pieces of paper. So I have a separate article that looks at the cases of Bosnia, and I think it's possibly, I'm not sure if it's North Macedonia or Moldova, and it looks at the composition and the independence of the judiciary and how that's really impacted their decisions when they've been asked to make decisions about whether one level of government is deviating from those agreed territorial self-government arrangements. So you really need to have a strong and independent judiciary. And the problem is that in many post-conflict countries, you don't have this. And in many conflict countries where perhaps one identity group or ethnic group has dominated political structures in the past, you may see people from that group at the top of the judicial branch of government, and that can impact the kind of decisions that are made when disputes reach the judiciary.
And in terms of the sort of haggling and negotiations between the different levels, how far, because you've talked about a clear list, but how far should the agreement be clear in those negotiations? What will be the key issues needed to be addressed already at the negotiations of the competence list?
Yeah, so I think that if you kind of broadly divide up your policies around kind of defense and international and kind of foreign policy, economic policy and social policy, and then you look and you think, well, at which level does it make sense for policies in this category to be implemented or to be made? So I like I said, I do think you need to build some flexibility in, because you don't know how different policy areas are going to develop or emerge. But I would always think about it, and it would be quite unusual, for example, for a sub-state unit to have any role in defence policy or in foreign policy, but it would be very usual for them to provide social care or education. So you do see patterns across areas. That's not to say that you can't have a foreign policy role as a sub-state federal unit, but it would be quite unusual.
We've just spoken about the judiciary and the need for its independence. Even when a country manages to reach the federalist state, how can we ensure that the federal and the regional level governments are responsible? So where are the checks and balances?
Well, so if we're talking about a democracy, the ultimate check and balance in a democracy is the ballot box. So if you have a government either at federal level or at sub-state unit level that is not delivering for the population in a functioning democracy, they should be voted out and there should be a clear opposition. And this is why other aspects of democracy are also important. So freedom of speech, freedom of association, so that you can have a meaningful opposition there as an alternative if citizens are dissatisfied with the kind of government that they're receiving.
Turning to a different country at the end, where we're running out of time, but there's a question on Nepal. a country like Nepal, which is moving ahead in the practice of federalism, how many years can it take for the institutional development, or rather the sort of federalization of a country? Can the success or failure of federalism be reviewed in 5 years of practice, or would that be too short of a time frame?
So I think that it is reasonable, and when we look at peace agreements in general, it's interesting that the question asker said 5 years, because 5 years is always kind of the magical amount of time, and that experts or policymakers look at a political institution or a peace agreement to ask if it's being successful. And I think that that is a reasonable amount of time to allow institutions to develop and norms to embed. And that's not to say that where an institution is in 5 years is the best it's going to get. There is still, of course, space for constant development, but I do think that between a 5 and a 10 year kind of post an agreement to federalize or democratize or whatever political reform you're talking about is a reasonable period at which point to take a moment, have a look and see. And if you can identify any problems or any barriers to your federalization, this is also a good interim point at which to try and address those.
And lastly, last question, going back to the question of trust. How much does that relate to the political culture? And do you think in some countries, like, for example, Myanmar, a lack of trust is due to a lack, or to the political culture? Again, that of course goes back to, is it a democratic country or not? But since you said trust is key for federalism, how can you sort of shape the political, or what kind of political culture does it take to ensure trust between the different parties, especially in a country where you have so many different ethnicities as well?
Yes, that is really the key difficulty. And in most post-conflict countries that I've been looking at, obviously trust is very low. Often you've had entire minority or identity groups who have been excluded from the political system before a peace agreement. And so while I think that trust is key, the reason that I focus on guarantees is because trust doesn't build overnight. So I think that these guarantee mechanisms, what you're not necessarily looking for is the parties to trust each other initially. You're looking for them to trust the institutions. And if they trust that the institutions work and they start to work with each other in these institutions, then I think the trust between groups can develop over time. Obviously, in peace agreements, you also have the issue of you often have confidence building measures along the way. So these grand, comprehensive or final peace agreements are often the culmination of months or even years of a peace process, or now in Northern Ireland or Dayton, you could say decades of a peace process. And trust develops over time. And you can have confidence measures separate from federalism, things around demobilization or disarmament of combatants, things like security sector reform, that where you have a side make a move that shows trust or shows the respect to another conflict party, that over time those acts can build confidence between the parties.
Right. Well, we're running out of time, I'm afraid. We're just a few minutes over. But thank you very much, Dawn. This has been fascinating. And you've seen the number of questions showed how insightful it was for our audience as well. And thank you very much for addressing them all, even if you're not a Myanmar expert. But this is all we've got time for today. There will be another seminar soon on the 13th of December. We will hear from Vishnu Alok from India, who will talk about federalism and COVID-19 in India, but we'll also, of course, have a broader discussion on how other federalist countries have coped better or not with the pandemic. This leaves me to thank you again, Dawn, and our audience for tuning in today. And I hope I will see you again or hear your questions on the 13th of December. Until then, bye-bye.
Thank you, Anya.